The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful, not calm, just quiet in a way that made my breathing feel loud. I remember standing near a doorway, my shoes already off, my hands folded the way I'd been taught to fold them when I didn't want to take up space. The carpet beneath my feet was soft, thicker than anything I had ever walked on before. It felt wrong, like standing on something meant for someone else. I told myself this was work, temporary, just a few hours. I had memorized those words on the ride over. I repeated them in my head, the way people pray. Outside, the city moved like it always did, cars, sirens, voices, normal life. Inside that house, time slowed. The air smelled expensive, like flowers that never wilt and cleaning products that erase evidence of living. Every object seemed placed deliberately, as if even accidents were planned here. I didn't understand the rules yet. I only understood that I had already crossed a line I couldn't see. Someone spoke my name, softly, not asking, informing. I flinched, then hated myself for it. I had learned young that reacting makes things worse. Poverty teaches you that. So does being young. So does being a girl who knows the electricity bill at home is overdue, and that her mother pretends not to notice the final warning letters. I thought about that as I followed the voice down a hallway lined with photographs, smiling faces, famous places, proof of a life so far from mine that it felt fictional. I remember thinking how strange it was that a place this beautiful could make my chest feel so tight. No one touched me then. Nothing happened yet, not in the way people imagine when they hear stories like mine. But something shifted. Something inside me leaned backward, like it already knew it would need distance to survive. I noticed the doors, how heavy they were, how quietly they closed. I noticed there were no clocks. I noticed how easily everyone else moved, like this space belonged to them by birthright. I noticed how my voice sounded smaller than I expected when I answered questions. Questions that weren't really questions. Where are you from? How old are you? Do you need the money? That last one landed differently. It wasn't curiosity. It was confirmation. In that moment, I understood something without having language for it yet. This place did not run on violence. It ran on certainty. On the confidence that no matter what happened here, it would stay here, inside these walls, inside people like me. I didn't know the man's name then. Not yet. I only knew that this house had swallowed girls before me and would swallow girls after me, quietly, efficiently, without leaving marks anyone wanted to see. And standing there, barefoot on borrowed luxury, I realized the most dangerous thing about that house wasn't what might happen. It was how normal it was expected to feel. No one snatched me off a street corner. No one dragged me anywhere. That's important to say, because the world likes simple villains and simple victims. What happened to me was quieter than that. Polite, wrapped in opportunity. I was found the way many girls like me are found, through need. Someone noticed me when I was trying to be invisible. A friend of a friend. A woman who smiled too easily and spoke about help. She asked questions that felt caring at the time. How old are you? Are you still in school? Do you help your family? Do you need extra money? I didn't tell her everything. I didn't have to. Need has a smell. People who look for it know exactly what to listen for. They hear it in pauses, in hesitation, in the way you say, "I'm fine," too quickly. The offer wasn't framed as danger. It was framed as rescue. A job, easy work, flexible hours. Good pay for someone my age. No experience needed. Travel covered. A chance to see places I had only seen on screens. I remember the word massage being used, but vaguely, like a suggestion, not a requirement. I remember being told I'd be safe, that I'd be looked after. I remember being told that girls like me were lucky to be chosen. At home, the fridge was half empty. At school, teachers talked about futures that felt theoretical. Every adult conversation around me circled money like it was weather. Unavoidable. Destructive, never anyone's fault. When I mentioned the opportunity, no one asked too many questions. People don't interrogate hope when it finally shows up. I told myself I was mature enough to handle it. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself I was helping. There were forms, not real contracts, just enough paperwork to make it feel official. Phone numbers that always worked. Drivers who showed up exactly when promised. Everything was smooth, in a way my real life never was. That should have been the warning. But when you grow up with chaos, order feels like safety. When adults fail you consistently, competence feels like kindness. No one explained the full picture. They didn't need to. Each step was small enough to justify on its own. A meeting, a ride, a stay, a favor, always framed as optional. always followed by silence that made saying no feel awkward, ungrateful. By the time I reached that house, I had already agreed to more than I understood. Not because I was reckless, because the system was designed that way, because consent can be manufactured when the alternative is hunger, debt, or going back to a life that never protected you anyway. Looking back, I see how carefully I was guided, how many exits disappeared without anyone locking a door. I wasn't chosen because I was special. I was chosen because I was available, believable, and unlikely to be defended. And by the time I realized that, I was already inside. The house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a set. Everything was perfect, in a way that discouraged questions. The furniture looked untouched, like no one ever relaxed there. The walls held art I didn't recognize, but somehow knew was expensive. There were mirrors placed where you wouldn't expect them, catching reflections you didn't ask to see. I was shown where to stand, where to wait, where not to go. Rules were never announced. They didn't have to be. Everyone else already knew them, and I learned quickly by watching. Silence wasn't requested, it was assumed. Curiosity wasn't punished, it was ignored, which was worse. Jeffrey Epstein entered the room like someone who expected space to move for him. He didn't rush, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Power like his doesn't announce itself, it settles. When he looked at me, it wasn't with hunger or anger. It was with assessment, like inventory, like something already accounted for. He spoke calmly, asked questions that sounded friendly but felt transactional. How old are you? Are you comfortable? Do you understand what's expected? I nodded more than I spoke, not because I understood, but because confusion felt dangerous. In that world, clarity belonged to the people in control. There were assistants moving in and out of the room, always nearby, always watching, always making sure everything stayed smooth. They smiled, but their eyes were busy, monitoring, recording without cameras. Luxury surrounded us, but it didn't comfort me. It made me feel smaller, poorer, replaceable. I became aware of my posture, my clothes, the way my accent sounded. I became aware that I was being measured against something invisible. There were moments when nothing happened, long stretches of waiting. That was part of it too. Waiting trains you. It teaches you to accept uncertainty, to stay ready, to suspend your own needs. I remember thinking how strange it was that such a powerful man seemed so uninterested in my thoughts, my story, my humanity. I wasn't there to be known. I was there to function. Nothing explicit needs to be described to explain what that feels like. The absence of safety says enough. What struck me most was how routine it all seemed to everyone else. This wasn't chaos, it was schedule. Appointments, logistics, girls arriving, girls leaving. Like a service that had been running long enough to forget it was ever shocking. I realized then that this world existed parallel to the one outside. Same city, same laws, different rules. Rules enforced not by force, but by wealth, reputation, and the quiet understanding that no one here would face consequences. I didn't know how to leave yet. I didn't even know what I was leaving. But I knew one thing clearly. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a system, and I had just stepped into its center. The first warning wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scream, or a locked door, or a sudden threat. It was a pause. A moment where something was said casually that didn't fit the story I had been told. I remember being given instructions that contradicted what I believed I had agreed to. They were delivered calmly, like reminders, not negotiations. When I hesitated, no one argued with me. No one raised their voice. They just waited. That waiting was the warning. Silence can be a form of pressure. When someone powerful goes quiet, the burden shifts to you to fill the space, to justify yourself, to comply so the world can keep moving smoothly. I asked a question, a small one, something about boundaries, about what I was supposed to do. The response wasn't an answer. It was a look exchanged between adults who didn't need to speak out loud. It was the sudden awareness that I was the only person in the room who didn't already know how this worked. Someone said, "This is how it's done here," not explaining, closing. That sentence carried more weight than any threat could have. It told me there was a before me and an after me, and neither required my consent to continue. It told me resistance wasn't unexpected. It was just inconvenient. I felt heat rise in my face, embarrassment before fear, shame before anger. I didn't want to seem naive. I didn't want to seem difficult. I didn't want to be the girl who ruined the atmosphere. That's how control often begins, not by force, but by social pressure, by making you responsible for everyone else's comfort. I noticed then how the assistants positioned themselves, not blocking exits, just present enough to remind me I wasn't alone, even though I was. I noticed how casually money was mentioned, as if it were reassurance, not leverage. I noticed how quickly my options narrowed. No one said I couldn't leave, but everything in the room suggested I shouldn't. The ride waiting outside, the schedule already set, the implication that walking away would be messy, embarrassing, ungrateful. I thought about my family, about how I had already told them this opportunity would help, about how I couldn't explain quitting without admitting something was wrong, and how saying something was wrong felt like accusing people who clearly didn't fear accusations. So I stayed, and in that choice, made under pressure so soft it almost felt voluntary, something broke its seal inside me. I understood that what I wanted mattered less than what was expected, that my discomfort was a minor obstacle in a machine designed to keep moving. That was the first warning, not of what would happen next, but of how easily it could continue. It took time to understand that what surrounded me wasn't chaos or impulse. It was organization. Jeffrey Epstein was not operating alone in a vacuum of bad decisions. He was the visible center of something much larger, something that functioned whether he was present or not. The house ran on routines. People arrived on time. Cars moved on schedule. Payments were calculated, prepared, delivered without discussion. There were drivers whose faces never changed, no matter who entered the car. Assistants who remembered details about me that I hadn't shared twice. Schedules that appeared without explanation and disappeared just as quietly. Everything worked too smoothly to be accidental. I began to see that Epstein wasn't the system. He was infrastructure. If he didn't show up, nothing stopped. Someone else handled it. If one girl disappeared, another arrived. There was no panic, no disruption. The machine absorbed losses and kept running. That realization was more frightening than anything else. Systems don't feel guilt. They don't hesitate. They don't care if you cry in the bathroom or stare at the ceiling afterward, wondering which part of yourself you misplaced. Systems care about efficiency, continuity, and silence. Money moved through this world like oxygen, quietly, constantly. It explained everything without being spoken. It explained why no one asked how old we really were, why no one asked if we were okay, why everything was framed as choice, while being engineered to feel inevitable. I saw how authority was delegated. Epstein didn't have to instruct every detail. People anticipated his preferences. They protected his comfort. They protected the environment that protected him. And beyond the house, there was an even wider system. Legal structures, social structures, a shared understanding that some people existed above consequence, that what happened here would never reach the outside world in a way that mattered. I wasn't just dealing with one man's behavior. I was inside a network that had already calculated my insignificance. That's why leaving felt impossible, even before it was explicitly discouraged. Because you don't escape systems by walking away from a room. You escape them by dismantling what allows them to exist. And that kind of power doesn't belong to girls like me. At least, that's what the system counted on. Looking back, I understand something I couldn't articulate then. The greatest protection Epstein had wasn't secrecy. It was normalization. This wasn't framed as abuse. It was framed as business, as arrangement, as mutually beneficial exchange. When harm is packaged as routine, resistance feels irrational. I didn't yet know how many others were caught in the same machinery. I only knew that nothing here was improvised. Nothing here was accidental. And that meant I wasn't unlucky. I was selected. I started noticing them in pieces. Not all at once. Not in a way that allowed connection or comfort. We were kept just separate enough to prevent unity. Just visible enough to remind each other that we were replaceable. A girl passing in a hallway. Another waiting quietly. Eyes fixed on her phone like it could shield her. Accents I recognized, and accents I didn't. Some looked younger than me. Some tried very hard to look older. All of us carried the same tension in our shoulders, the same careful politeness. No one introduced us. We learned about each other through fragments. A name overheard. A country mentioned in passing. A whispered question in a bathroom that never fully formed. Where are you from? How long have you been here? Is this your first time? We didn't share stories. We shared glances. That was safer. I remember one girl who always arrived before me and left after. She never spoke, but she nodded once when our eyes met. not greeting, recognition, like we were both acknowledging something we couldn't say out loud. There were girls who disappeared suddenly. No explanation, no goodbye, just absence. At first, I told myself they had moved on, found something better, escaped. Later, I understood that disappearance didn't always mean freedom. Sometimes it just meant relocation, transfer, replacement. Some girls talked about their families, about siblings they sent money to, about visas expiring, about debts back home. The details were different, but the vulnerability was the same. We were all tethered to something that made resistance costly. What struck me most was how young some of us were emotionally, even when we tried to seem composed. Trauma compresses time. It makes you feel ancient and helpless at once. There was no bonding, no collective rebellion. That wasn't a failure of courage. It was design. Isolation keeps systems stable. Connection creates risk. We were taught, without being told, not to ask questions about each other, not to pry, not to compare. Comparison leads to awareness, and awareness leads to instability. So we stayed polite, fragmented, alone together. I carried their faces with me long after I stopped seeing them. Sometimes I still do. I wonder who made it out, who didn't, who learned to live with the silence, and who is still waiting for someone to listen. At the time, I didn't think of us as victims. That word felt too dramatic, too final. We were just girls trying to survive circumstances that had narrowed our choices to something unrecognizable. But standing there, among so many versions of the same fear, I began to understand something deeply unsettling. This wasn't about one girl's story. It was about volume. They arrived like expectations. No announcements, no introductions, just a subtle shift in the room when they entered, as if the air recalibrated itself around them. Assistants moved faster, voices softened. Everyone seemed to know where to stand. These men were not loud. They didn't need to be. Some wore the confidence of politics, the kind that comes from knowing laws bend before they break. Some carried the casual ease of extreme wealth, the assumption that anything uncomfortable could be handled by someone else. Others had reputations built on intellect or public admiration, men the world trusted without question. No names were spoken in front of us. Names didn't matter here. Status did. They treated the space as familiar, like returning to a place that owed them comfort. Some barely looked at us. Others smiled politely. The way people smile at staff they don't intend to remember. What unsettled me most was how ordinary they seemed. Not monsters, not shadows, just men who had learned that consequences were negotiable. I watched how Epstein deferred to them, not submissively, but strategically. He wasn't begging for approval. He was facilitating access. He understood his role in the hierarchy, and he played it well. These visitors didn't ask questions about us. Not our ages, not our consent, not our lives outside those walls. Silence protected them as much as it protected the system. I remember realizing that power doesn't always look like aggression. Sometimes it looks like comfort, like entitlement so ingrained doesn't recognize boundaries as real. When they left, nothing changed. The house reset itself instantly. New schedules, new instructions. The system absorbed their presence without friction. That's when it became clear to me. Epstein wasn't hiding these men. He was serving them, and they didn't fear exposure, because exposure requires belief. It requires institutions willing to listen. It requires a world that values the testimony of girls without money, passports, or influence. Standing there, invisible in plain sight, I understood that the danger wasn't just what happened in that house. It was what happened after, when men like these returned to public life, applauded and protected, while girls like us carried the weight alone. They left no fingerprints, but they left certainty. The certainty that even if one man fell, the system that welcomed them would still be waiting. They arrived like expectations. No announcements, no introductions, just a subtle shift in the room when they entered, as if the air recalibrated itself around them. Assistants moved faster, voices softened. Everyone seemed to know where to stand. These men were not loud. They didn't need to be. Some wore the confidence of politics, the kind that comes from knowing laws bend before they break. Some carried the casual ease of extreme wealth, the assumption that anything uncomfortable could be handled by someone else. Others had reputations built on intellect or public admiration, men the world trusted without question. No names were spoken in front of us. Names didn't matter here. Status did. They treated the space as familiar, like returning to a place that owed them comfort. Some barely looked at us. Others smiled politely. The way people smile at staff they don't intend to remember. What unsettled me most was how ordinary they seemed. Not monsters, not shadows, just men who had learned that consequences were negotiable. I watched how Epstein deferred to them, not submissively, but strategically. He wasn't begging for approval. He was facilitating access. He understood his role in the hierarchy, and he played it well. These visitors didn't ask questions about us. Not our ages, not our consent, not our lives outside those walls. Silence protected them as much as it protected the system. I remember realizing that power doesn't always look like aggression. Sometimes it looks like comfort, like entitlement so ingrained doesn't recognize boundaries as real. When they left, nothing changed. The house reset itself instantly. New schedules, new instructions. The system absorbed their presence without friction. That's when it became clear to me. Epstein wasn't hiding these men. He was serving them, and they didn't fear exposure, because exposure requires belief. It requires institutions willing to listen. It requires a world that values the testimony of girls without money, passports, or influence. Standing there, invisible in plain sight, I understood that the danger wasn't just what happened in that house. It was what happened after, when men like these returned to public life, applauded and protected, while girls like us carried the weight alone. They left no fingerprints, but they left certainty. The certainty that even if one man fell, the system that welcomed them would still be waiting. People ask that question like it has a simple answer. Why didn't you say no? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you tell someone? They imagine a moment where refusal is loud and clear, where doors slam and justice follows. That version of reality doesn't exist inside systems like this. No wasn't forbidden. It was just expensive. Every choice carried a cost, and the costs were designed to fall on us alone. Money we already depended on. Rides already arranged, housing already promised, futures already hinted at, and then quietly attached to compliance. For some girls, it was immigration, visas that felt temporary, even when they were legal. The constant reminder that being difficult could make everything complicated very quickly. Fear doesn't need to be explicit when uncertainty does the job just as well. For others, it was age. Being young enough to doubt your instincts, but old enough to be blamed for not knowing better. The space where innocence is no longer protected, but experience is still assumed. For me, it was dependence layered with shame. I had already accepted help, already taken money, already reassured people back home that everything was fine. Saying no now meant admitting I had misjudged something powerful. And people like me aren't encouraged to challenge power. There was also the quiet threat of unbelief, the awareness that if I spoke up, the question wouldn't be what happened, but who I was, my background, my choices, my credibility. The system trains you to anticipate disbelief long before it happens. No one said, if you refuse, something bad will happen. They didn't need to. The structure made it clear that cooperation was rewarded with smoothness, and resistance would introduce friction into a life already full of it. When survival depends on stability, even harmful stability can feel safer than chaos. There were moments when I wanted to disappear, to become smaller than I already felt, to finish what was expected and leave without being noticed. That instinct to minimize harm by minimizing yourself is not weakness, it's adaptation. People also forget how isolation works. We weren't given mirrors to compare notes. We didn't know how many others felt the same fear, the same reluctance. Alone, doubt feels personal. Together, it becomes evidence. The system thrived on that separation. So we complied, not because we agreed, but because the cost of refusal was designed to look worse than the cost of silence. And when silence is the cheapest option, it becomes routine. Silence doesn't end when you leave the room. It follows you home. It settles into your routines. It shows up in places you don't expect. At grocery stores, in classrooms, in conversations that feel suddenly distant. Silence is not empty, it's crowded. At first, I thought I was coping well. I showed up where I was supposed to. I smiled when people asked how things were going. I told myself that what happened didn't define me, because I refused to name it. But the body remembers, even when the mouth stays closed. I started sleeping lightly, waking at sounds that didn't matter. My thoughts looped without permission. Ordinary decisions, what to wear, where to go, who to trust, felt loaded, like traps disguised as choices. I carried guilt that didn't belong to me. Guilt for accepting money. Guilt for not leaving sooner. Guilt for not warning other girls. Silence has a way of turning harm inward, convincing you that if you had been stronger, smarter, less needy, things would have been different. I avoided mirrors for a while, not because I didn't recognize myself, but because I did. I saw someone who had learned how to disappear while still standing in front of people. The hardest part wasn't fear, it was doubt. Doubt that what I experienced was bad enough to count. Doubt that anyone would listen without asking why I stayed. Doubt that I could tell the story without losing control of it. I watched how the world responded to stories like mine, when they surfaced at all. The scrutiny, the skepticism, the way survivors were dissected for inconsistencies instead of believed for patterns. That observation became another reason to stay quiet. Silence also isolates you from yourself. You split into versions, the one who knows, and the one who performs normalcy. Holding both at once is exhausting. It drains your ability to feel present, to imagine a future that isn't shaped by avoidance. I didn't talk about Epstein. I didn't talk about the house. I didn't talk about the men, but I carried them anyway, in the way my shoulders tensed when authority entered a room, in the way my voice softened automatically, in the way I learned to anticipate expectations before they were spoken. Silence demanded maintenance, constant vigilance, constant editing of memory. It was work I never applied for. And yet, at the time, it still felt safer than speaking, because silence only harmed me. Speaking, I believed, would harm everyone. When I finally stopped going, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no farewell, no sense of victory. The system didn't chase me because it didn't need to. It had already taken what it wanted. My disappearance was just another adjustment in a schedule I no longer saw. I expected relief. Instead, I felt untethered. Leaving didn't feel like freedom. It felt like being released from a room, only to discover the door had followed me. I was no longer inside Epstein's world, but his world had rearranged how I moved through mine. I kept waiting for my life to return to its previous shape. It didn't. That version of me had stayed behind, folded into the silence of that house. Ordinary interactions became complicated. Authority figures unsettled me. Compliments felt transactional. Kindness came with invisible terms and conditions I couldn't stop searching for. I tried to explain my unease to myself in neutral language. Stress, adjustment, fatigue, anything but the truth. Naming it felt dangerous, like reopening a door that had barely closed. I avoided places that reminded me of wealth, of control disguised as generosity. I avoided conversations about success that treated money as proof of morality. I avoided questions about what I had been doing during that time. Time didn't heal it. Time just gave it more places to hide. There were moments when I felt angry, not explosive anger, but a quiet resentment that hummed beneath everything. Anger that the world had continued, uninterrupted. Anger that the men I saw in that house were still admired, still protected by distance and reputation. Anger that my suffering didn't register anywhere official. But anger requires permission, and I didn't feel entitled to it yet. Instead, I became careful, careful with trust, careful with ambition, careful not to attract attention. Trauma teaches you that visibility is risky, even when you're no longer in danger. People sometimes think survival ends when the threat disappears. They don't understand that survival skills don't switch off automatically. You carry them into places they no longer belong. I left Epstein's world physically. Psychologically, it took much longer. And in that long in-between, where I wasn't trapped but wasn't free, I learned the most painful lesson of all. Escape is not the same as safety. Safety requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was still nowhere in sight. For a long time, I believed justice was slow because it was careful. I told myself that powerful institutions took time, that evidence had to be gathered, that the truth, when it came, would arrive clean and undeniable. That patience was part of the process. Then I started paying attention. Stories surfaced and vanished. Rumors appeared at the edges of conversation and were quietly dismissed. Journalists hinted at things they never fully said. Lawsuits stalled. Investigations narrowed instead of widened. I watched how language was used, how allegations followed survivors like shadows, while powerful men were described with titles, achievements, and benefit of the doubt. I watched how credibility was assigned based on status, not consistency. It became clear that the system wasn't failing. It was functioning. Legal complexity became a shield. Jurisdictional confusion became an excuse. Non-disclosure agreements became walls. Settlements became silence disguised as resolution. Every mechanism that claimed to protect fairness somehow bent toward protecting influence. I realized then why nothing had happened sooner, why Epstein moved so openly, why the house never felt hidden. He wasn't reckless. He was insulated. Power creates buffers between action and consequence, between harm and accountability. Those buffers are staffed by professionals, lawyers, fixers, advisors, people who understand exactly how much truth can surface without threatening the structure beneath it. And beyond that, there was social protection, the reluctance to confront men who donated generously, hosted impressively, and existed comfortably within elite circles. No one wanted to be the person who disrupted that ecosystem. The system didn't need to deny what happened. It just needed to delay it. Delay until memories faded, until victims aged out of public sympathy, until evidence became complicated. Delay until silence looked like resolution. Understanding this was devastating in a way I hadn't expected. It meant the harm wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It meant my silence wasn't an anomaly, it was anticipated. I stopped asking why no one helped sooner. I started asking who benefited from waiting. That shift was painful, but it was clarifying. It moved the weight off my shoulders and placed it where it belonged, on a structure that had every opportunity to intervene and chose comfort instead. For the first time, I saw my story not as a failure to speak, but as proof of how thoroughly speaking had been discouraged. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The silence wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The silence didn't break all at once. It cracked. At first, it was barely noticeable. An article that went further than usual. A question asked in public that wasn't immediately shut down. A survivor speaking, not confidently, not loudly, but steadily enough to be recorded. I remember the first time I realized I wasn't alone in a way that mattered. It wasn't because someone told my exact story. It was because the shape of it appeared somewhere else. Different details, same structure, same recruitment, same promises, same quiet machinery. Patterns are dangerous to systems built on denial. When one person speaks, they can be dismissed. When several speak separately and still describe the same architecture, dismissal becomes harder, not impossible, but harder. I watched journalists start to listen differently, not as scandal hunters, but as people trying to map something larger than one crime. They asked about logistics, about money, about who arranged what and how often. They stopped looking for shocking details and started looking for consistency. That shift mattered. For years, the story had been framed as individual misconduct. A bad man, an isolated predator, something aberrant and therefore containable. But as more voices emerged, the frame widened. This wasn't about impulse. It was about infrastructure. I felt something unfamiliar then, not hope exactly, but tension, the kind that precedes movement, the sense that the ground beneath the system was no longer completely solid. Still, speaking felt risky. Visibility had consequences. I watched survivors be questioned, analyzed, doubted. I watched timelines be scrutinized more aggressively than power structures. I watched how even cracks were met with resistance. But something had shifted. The silence no longer felt total. There were echoes now, connections forming across distance and time, survivors recognizing themselves in each other without needing to coordinate. I began to understand that truth doesn't always arrive as a single revelation. Sometimes it accumulates quietly, until denial requires more effort than acknowledgement. I didn't step forward immediately. I needed to understand what was happening first, to see if the cracks would be sealed again, to see if the system would absorb this too. But for the first time, the silence felt unstable, and instability, even when frightening, is the beginning of change. Revenge is usually imagined as destruction. I didn't want destruction. I wanted accuracy. When I finally began to speak, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't raise my voice or demand punishment. I did something far quieter and far more threatening to the system. I documented dates, locations, patterns, the order of events, who arranged transportation, who followed up, who disappeared when questions were asked. I wrote things down the way investigators do, not the way victims are expected to. Emotion stayed, but it no longer led. That shift was intentional. Systems like the one I survived rely on confusion, on fragmented memories, on the assumption that trauma makes stories unreliable. So I learned to separate feeling from fact, not to erase the harm, but to make it undeniable. I wasn't alone in this. Others were doing the same thing, separately, without coordination. That mattered. Independent records that mirrored each other, timelines that aligned without rehearsal, details that matched not because we planned them, but because the system had been consistent. This is what nonviolent revenge looks like. Not punishment, but exposure through precision. Truth became less about accusation and more about architecture, showing how recruitment worked, how money moved, how silence was incentivized, how deniability was engineered. I didn't need to name names. The structure spoke for itself. When patterns repeat across survivors who never met, coincidence becomes implausible. What surprised me most was how empowering this process felt. Not because it erased the past, it didn't, but because it returned authorship to me. For years, my story had existed only as something I avoided. Now it existed as evidence. I noticed a change in how people listened when facts replaced emotion as the entry point. They leaned in. They asked follow-up questions. They stopped interrupting. They stopped asking why and started asking how. That's when I understood something important. The system wasn't afraid of anger. It was afraid of coherence. Anger can be dismissed as instability. Documentation can't. This kind of revenge doesn't end with a headline or a sentence. It unfolds slowly, through records that don't forget, through archives that don't get tired, through testimonies that can be revisited, even when voices shake. I wasn't seeking to hurt anyone. I was seeking to make it impossible to pretend nothing had happened. And once truth is recorded clearly enough, silence can no longer claim neutrality. It becomes a choice the system was increasingly forced to defend. People often assume silence around names means fear. Sometimes it does, but that isn't the whole truth. I chose not to name the men I encountered, not because I was protecting them, but because naming them would have narrowed the story in a way that served the system, not the survivors. Names turn structures into scandals. They allow people to argue about personalities instead of patterns. If you name one man, the system responds by isolating him, by presenting him as an exception, a flaw, a bad apple that can be removed so everything else can remain untouched. I wasn't interested in that kind of closure. What mattered wasn't who walked through that house on any given day. What mattered was that the house existed at all, that it was staffed, scheduled, supplied, and socially insulated, that powerful people knew how to find it, trusted it, and returned to their public lives unchanged. Names invite deflection. Patterns invite accountability. By focusing on how the system functioned, how girls were recruited, how silence was enforced, how authority was never questioned, I kept the lens where it belonged, on the conditions that made harm repeatable. I also understood something deeply personal. Naming would have exposed me to a different kind of harm. Endless debate about credibility, endless speculation, endless pressure to perform trauma in ways the public finds convincing. I had already lost enough control over my story. This wasn't about proving I was harmed by a specific individual. It was about showing that harm was predictable, reproducible, and profitable within a structure that rewarded power and punished vulnerability. When survivors across countries describe the same choreography, different faces, same steps, names become unnecessary. The truth emerges through alignment. There is also safety in refusing to reduce a systemic crime to individual blame. Systems survive by sacrificing people when necessary. I didn't want a sacrifice. I wanted transformation. Some people accused us of being vague, of withholding, of protecting the powerful. They missed the point. The most powerful thing we did was refuse to let the story be simplified, refuse to give the system an easy exit, refuse to allow justice to be framed as the downfall of one man, while everything else reset itself quietly. Names fade, structures persist. So we documented the structure, and in doing so, we made it visible in a way no single accusation ever could. When Jeffrey Epstein finally fell, the world reacted as if the story had ended. Headlines surged, images circulated. A single name became shorthand for years of harm. People spoke in absolutes, evil exposed, justice approaching, closure within reach. From the outside, it looked like resolution. From the inside, it felt unfinished. Yes, something shifted. The illusion of untouchability cracked. The confidence that silence would last forever weakened. For the first time, the system had lost its most visible pillar. But pillars are not foundations. Epstein's removal disrupted operations, not beliefs, It startled the network, but it did not dismantle it. The house was gone, but the conditions that allowed it to exist remained largely intact. I watched how quickly the narrative narrowed, how the focus tightened around one man's behavior, one man's pathology, one man's downfall. It was comforting to believe that identifying a villain solved the problem. It didn't. The same questions went unanswered. How did this operate for so long? Who facilitated it? Who benefited? Who chose not to look? Those questions were uncomfortable, and discomfort rarely survives sustained public attention. There were moments of reckoning, hearings, reports, promises, and there were moments of retreat. Settlements reached quietly, conversations redirected, fatigue set in. The system adapted. Some people genuinely wanted accountability. Others wanted reassurance that this was an anomaly, a rare corruption, rather than a reflection of how power behaves when it goes unchecked. For survivors, the aftermath was complex. Validation arrived alongside grief. Relief mixed with anger. Speaking became safer, but not safe. The spotlight was harsh and selective. It illuminated some truths, while leaving others in shadow. Epstein's fall mattered. It proved something we had been told was impossible, that exposure could reach even the most insulated. But it also revealed how much depended on one figure carrying the weight of collective responsibility. I didn't celebrate. I observed. I watched which conversations continued and which ones stopped. I watched who expressed shock and who expressed inconvenience. I watched how quickly the world began to look for an ending. There was no ending. There was only a pause. A moment where the system recalibrated, assessed damage, and prepared to move forward in quieter forms. Epstein fell. The system shook, and then it waited, hoping memory would do what force never could: fade.
The real shift didn't happen in a courtroom or a headline. It happened slowly, in places that don't trend. It happened the first time I spoke without rehearsing how to protect everyone else in the room. The first time I corrected someone instead of shrinking. The first time my story felt like mine again, not something I owed the world in exchange for belief. Power had always moved in one direction before, from the top down, from certainty to silence. What changed wasn't the balance of money or influence. What changed was authorship. For years, the system wrote my role for me: victim, footnote, liability. I was something to be managed, contained, delayed. That ended when I stopped waiting for permission to exist as a witness. I didn't become fearless. That's a myth. Fear still shows up, but it no longer controls the shape of my decisions. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing clarity anyway. There was power in permanence, in records that couldn't be erased by intimidation or fatigue, in knowing that even if attention drifted, the truth didn't depend on being watched to remain true. I stopped measuring success by outcomes I couldn't control: arrests, sentences, public apologies. Those things matter, but they are not the only forms of justice. For a long time, I believed justice had to arrive externally to be real. I was wrong. Justice also lives in reclamation, in refusing to let harm dictate the rest of your life's architecture, in deciding that what happened to you will not be the most interesting thing about you, but it will be accurately remembered. The system thrives on erasure, on survivors aging out of relevance, on stories being labeled old news. I learned that longevity is resistance. Every time the truth is revisited, it costs the system energy to deny it again. Every time a new person learns the pattern, the structure weakens slightly. I don't need to be loud anymore. I don't need to convince. The record exists. The connections are there for anyone willing to look. That is the final power shift. Not dominance over those who harmed me, but independence from their gravity. They no longer define the limits of my voice. They never did. There is no moment where everything resolves. No scene where the music swells and the past releases its grip. What comes instead is something quieter and more durable, truth existing without permission. I live with what happened, but it no longer lives at the center of me. It has a place now, documented, contextualized, understood as part of a larger design rather than a personal failure. That matters. It changes the weight of memory. Some days are ordinary. That used to feel impossible. Ordinary days once felt suspicious, like calm was something that could be revoked at any moment. Now, ordinary feels earned. Not because justice arrived fully formed, but because I stopped waiting for the world to validate what I already knew. The system still exists. Power still protects itself. Silence still offers comfort to those who benefit from it. I don't pretend otherwise. The difference is that silence no longer has the final word. I think about the girls sometimes, not as symbols, not as a collective tragedy, but as individuals whose lives intersected briefly in a place designed to erase individuality. I hope some of them found their way back to themselves. I hope some of them found language. I hope some of them found peace that didn't require forgetting. I no longer measure progress by headlines. I measure it by recognition. By the moment someone hears this story and understands it as a pattern, not an anomaly. By the moment, a young person recognizes recruitment tactics for what they are. By the moment, disbelief gives way to listening. There is no satisfaction in this ending. No triumph. That would feel dishonest. What exists instead is steadiness. The kind that comes from knowing the truth has been placed somewhere it can't be undone. I entered that house as a teen, believing I was alone in my confusion and fear. I left as someone else, not because I was changed by what was done to me, but because I refused to let it remain unspoken. The men who passed through that world are still powerful. The structures that protected them are still adapting. But the story no longer belongs to them. It belongs to the record. It belongs to memory. This wasn't revenge. It was memory.